Hi everyone, I thought I'd sit down today and do the bulk of my February wrap up, and then whenever I finish the rest of the stuff in the last week of February, I'll just like add them in and talk a little bit about them. So the first book that I read, it was kind of like a bit of blended reading. I listened to the audio, I physically read it, I read a little bit on an ebook, and it was a buddy read as well that I did with Deborah from Hills of Books on Instagram and Katie Ellen's Bookish Adventure also on Instagram. That buddy read was for Daughter of the Moon Goddess by Sue Lin Tan, and I ended up absolutely adoring this. So I gave this one a 5 out of 5 stars. I loved it. Exiled to live on the moon with her mother, Xingying has only ever known solitude until her power flares alerts the celestial emperor who exiled her mother, forcing Xingying to flee home in search for a safer future. I loved all that Xingying stood for. She did come across as stubborn and prideful, but I thought it was more of like a strong sense of self and resilience, that I feel like her competitive nature and determination to prove herself came from this isolation that she'd lived in pretty much all her life until she had to flee home, and seeing her growth and how she learnt to kind of talk to people and be around other people was spectacular. I absolutely loved that. It was such a strong character study, character growth in this, but there is equal measure for an amazing plot as well. I did struggle a bit with the time jumps that we had in this. I felt like so much happened so fast, especially in the beginning half, but by part 2 that's the preferred writing style I enjoyed, and I think my buddy read companions also felt the same, that part 2 is when the writing really got strong and it felt more settled in its pace and the direction that it was going in. I had so many conflicting emotions toward Li Wei and Wenshu. I was absolutely heartbroken though. It was a love triangle, and I don't typically enjoy love triangles, but this one was just done perfectly. But I wouldn't say the romance is necessarily like the main thing about this story at all. If you're like me, you don't read well, I say that I've actually found a new love for a specific type of romance, but that'll come later on in the video. But generally, if you don't read an awful lot of romance, you don't pick up fantasy for romance, I'd still say you'd probably really enjoy this one, because it's there, but it's not the main driving force, but it is gripping. It definitely captures your heartstrings. I really enjoyed the heavier military portions of this book as well. I don't think I've ever really read a book where our character kind of gets recruited in a way and builds up in sort of military prestige, but I really very much enjoyed that, and I liked that also helped build up Xingying's character, her growth, and kind of sculpted her personality as well, and what she would accept in a personal way. Because, you know, when you're training for hours and hours and hours a day, you've done battle, you can imagine it strengthened your mind in some ways, and I feel like that was reflected once she did begin her training, once she became quite acclaimed in that. It definitely sculpted the way she responded to emotional situations, I would say. I have some quotes, and the one I will choose from this is, "The work I do is not a reflection of who I am," which I thought was a fantastic takeaway from this. I decided to do a reading vlog, picking up books that are out of my comfort zone for whatever reason, and the first book that I picked up for that vlog was Before the Coffee Gets Cold by Toshikazu Kawaguchi, translated from the Japanese by Jeffrey Troslet. I will give you guys my thoughts about this when that vlog goes live, but we are following 4 short stories that are interconnected, and they're all taking place in this quiet but special cafe, where a local legend says that if you sit in a particular seat, you have the opportunity to visit the past. And yeah, that's all I'm gonna say for now, because as I say, that reading vlog will be up somewhere in the near future. After that, I picked up Trapped, and this is by Shitaro Kago. and I would say this is like definitely adult horror. It's a very disturbing, interconnecting short stories, again following a parasitic outbreak of some sort, and this one I gave a 3 stars. It's a silent manga, I would call it. There's no text on the page, there's no dialogue of any kind, it's just illustrations, but it follows along with this story. The story itself and the art made me feel so itchy and gross, so it definitely got like a tick for body horror and gore. The art had such impeccable detail. Although I had to stop a lot of times because it just made me feel sick, I did like really find myself staring at some of the details in this because it was just extraordinary. I loved that it was a silent story, and I feel like the art got the point across clear enough for sure. Next up, I listened to my Audible audiobook of the month, and that was Spare by PeaceAndCookies. So yeah, a lot of people have circulated the audio about the Elizabeth Arden cream and his frostbitten Todger, and that's of course why I wanted to pick it up as well. And of course it's a memoir recounting his life in his own words, so I ended up giving this a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I think one of the bigger controversies I was intrigued to hear his opinion about and his kind of takeaway from was when he dressed up as a Nazi for Halloween, as well as the other like brainless things he did in his youth to get him dubbed as the Thicko, Prince Harry the Thicko they called him. And yeah, it gave a bit more insight into what was going through his mind, or maybe what wasn't going through his mind. It was just interesting to kind of hear the source talk about that situation and reflect on it as well. I was more invested with how he talked about his relationship with Meghan and the relationships that both grew from that blossom, as well as became difficult within the royal family, and hearing how tensions kind of rose and things like that. Hearing about his struggles with dealing with emotion after the death of his mother was quite heartbreaking to hear, particularly coming from a similar you know, maternal loss. In that way I feel empathy towards him there. But I'm glad he eventually got therapy for his bereavement, even though it came years later. I feel like therapy, whether you do it straight away, years later, whatever, on and off, you know, it's there. It's a good outlet to have. There were a lot of instances where he was just so far removed from reality. He was like whinging about things and you're like, come on dude, see the bigger picture, look around you. But overall this was actually an absorbing memoir, and I enjoyed it, or I found it more interesting than I thought I was going to. To that I read an e-arc that I received from Book Sirens, and it's published by Traum, so thank you to Book Sirens and the publishers for allowing me an e-copy. And this is Darknesses by Michelle Seville. So we are following a storyline where our main character, Oasis, is deprogramming after surviving from a cult and escaping, and she's slowly adapting to life again when Laura enters her life to sweep her off her feet and claims to be the Dracula. So this one I gave a 3 out of 5 stars in total. So I don't really know what I was expecting when I went to this, but it wasn't this. In a complex way. There's more meaning behind that, and I do go into more detail in my written reviews on Goodreads and Storygraphs if you'd like a bit more like comprehension behind what I'm saying. It's more of a Dracula retelling than I was expecting, however with lots more diversity, sex scenes and trauma specific to the cult communal free living. And had I fully grasped this prior to picking it up and reading, I think it would have saved me a lot of confusion, specifically with how paranormal it got and how quickly it got that way. And I could have perhaps loved it far more, so that's just on me. I just didn't realise really where that story was going to go and how heavily influenced it was going to be from Dracula. But I do also feel like it lost its way by trying to include everything, like so much so, there were so many themes that it felt too long and too chaotic a lot of the time. Although I'd say I generally enjoyed the relationship and the steam, like the spice that came with it, I think it was a bit unbalanced, seeing how Oasis was still healing from a vulnerable time in her life, and the power dynamic just felt far too skewed for me. I think this is classed as like dark romance, and I definitely wouldn't rule out trying more from that subgenre, though I'd probably make sure I definitely knew what it was about before going in. This was a different read. It was an interesting experience. So I got loads of quotes for this, but I'm just going to pick off one. This one at the end is very beautiful. Again, it's about losing of like a parent. This is not goodbye, this is good night. Death is nothing but a shade of darkness that your eyes might never fully adjust to. I am not gone. I'm just so deep in shadow that you can't see me. I'm here, I'm watching, and I love you. Beautiful. After that, I read The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman, and I read that for a read aloud on the channel. That was my next book after finishing Dracula's Guest and Other Short Stories. This was the next one. It won a poll vote that I did on YouTube and Instagram. So that's up on the channel if you'd like to watch it now. It's just like an audio book that I did. So we're following a woman's state of mind rapidly descending, as all she has to look at are the same four walls and yellow wallpaper. I ended up giving this a 4 out of 5 stars. I really enjoyed this book. I feel like our main character was not properly cared for during what I felt to be postnatal depression. What I gathered to be her only form of entertainment, seeing shapes in her surroundings, and what was probably innocent to begin with, slowly walked into a sinister narrative in her mind, and it was quite scary to see that decline quite rapidly, because they were only in this rented house for like, I don't know what, a couple of months or so, even less than that. Her husband infuriated me because he didn't take concerns for her mental health seriously enough, gaslit her so many times and subjected her to neglect at a time when I think she really needed just comfort and time to sort of safely bond with her baby. This was a very moving short story, and I'm glad I finally read another classic that I have been wanting to get around to. Okay, next up we have another buddy read, and this time I read with Sharon Joy Reading, who I found first on TikTok. I actually have a full review for this one. This is The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandana, and you can check that video up in the cards if you'd like to give it a watch. But just to let you know what it's about, it's an uplifting magical romance about an isolated witch whose opportunity to embrace a quirky new family changes the course of her life. So as I say, if you're interested in my full review, check out the cards or the description, wherever I decide to put it. I again do have some quotes, and let's include, because I don't think I put quotes in the review, so let's choose a couple because there were some really good ones here. Elsewhere, Rosetta was with Belinda, gazing up at her with a look of total adoration, like she couldn't quite believe she existed. Mika didn't know what it must feel like to be 10 years old and to discover the existence of a beautiful black witch like Belinda, who had purple streaks in her thick black coils of hair, a Scottish accent, and a kind, sensible way of dealing with any nonsense. And let's pick another quote. But one thing I've noticed over the years is that some people are nice and some people are kind. Niceness is good manners and stopping to give someone directions. Niceness is all about what we do when other people are looking. Kindness, on the other hand, runs deep. Kindness is what happens when no one's looking. That's so true. Oh my god, that just encapsulates that so perfectly. Okay, another buddy read, and this time I read with Deborah, again from Hills of Books, and this was Law. So this is by Alexandra Bracken, and I read it, another blended kind of reading, physical and audio, mainly audio I would say. So every 7 years for 7 days Zeus punishes the gods and makes them mortal to be hunted by descendants of ancient bloodlines eager for their power. I'm really gutted because I gave this one a 1 out of 5 stars, and I thought I'd enjoy it more than I ended up doing. I didn't think I'd love it just because of some of the themes in here that I hadn't read before and didn't naturally appeal to me. Hello Elsa. But I thought I would enjoy it way more nevertheless. But I struggled to get into this even after switching to the audiobook around chapter 19. Despite getting through it quickly once I switched to the audiobook, I still didn't find the story entertaining, engaging or enjoyable, unfortunately. I don't know what the sort of trope is called, but the Hunger Games kind of vibe. I don't really like that sort of setup generally. I never really gravitate, this is the thing that I was saying, I don't usually gravitate to those sort of themes in books, and I think this might have been maybe the first time I'd read something like that. I'm not too sure, but I don't think that theme in a modern day setting with the Greek ancient pantheon, I just don't think it blended well for my tastes. I had no attachment to Laura, our main character, and I just didn't mesh well with any of the side characters either. So when, you know, awful things happened, I just had no connection, I just had no care really for those things, which sounds really detached and cold, but that's kind of how I felt. I did find it helpful to have the 7 years earlier flashbacks to slowly kind of peter out the history for this Aegon, which is what they call the Hunt. But I'm gutted this one didn't work out for me. I'll still try another book by Alexandra Bracken. I'd actually forgotten that I'd read Prosper Redding, and I really loved that one. But I've also got Darkest Minds, and that's another one that I'm sort of now thinking is like, I don't know if I'll love, but I've got it anyway, so I think eventually I'll read it. But yeah, Prosper Redding is, I love that one, and I've got the sequel that I need to get to, but this one sadly just wasn't for me. So quotes I have is, this was the thing with boys like him. What he was feeling then, that rage, wasn't the world falling in on him. It was an illusion shattering, the one that told him he deserved everything, and that it was owed to him simply because he existed. Alright, next up I read this ebook, and it's called Lore of the Land, Folklore and Wisdom from Wild Earth. So there's two books that are going to come up now and in another book's time. It's not the next book, it's the book after that, where I was typing in lore to my Borrow Box, which is my library service, because I was seeing if there was like a free audiobook on there, and I couldn't find one. So also Spare wasn't my audiobook of the month. That's a lie. Spare was last month's audiobook that I purchased for. This one is what I purchased for February's credits. Anyway, you don't care. Anyway, what I'm saying is, I was looking on my library service to see if they had lore that I could borrow. They didn't have the audiobook, but two books popped up that seemed interesting under similar names. This was one of them. So, Lore of the Land, Folklore and Wisdom from the Wild Earth by Claire Cox-Starkey. This is an illustrated compendium of folklore from across the world surrounding nature. And I gave this one a 4 out of 5 stars. It was a beautifully presented book aimed at a young audience. There was so much scope across a wide range of cultures, and I feel like it introduced an introductory information in a concise and pleasing way that would be engaging to the target audience, which I say is like middle grade kind of children age, and the illustrations were absolutely stunning as well, so I really enjoyed flying through that one. Next up is a book that I read for the Hear Our Voices book tour, which I have a book review already come out. I think it came out last weekend on the 4th, and that was for Black Candle Woman by Diane Marie Brown, and so I'll just give you the synopsis for this because, as I say, the book review is already out. So it's a multi-generational story about a curse, voodoo magic, a matriarchal family and secrets being unearthed. So if you want to know more about that book, then check out that video, again linked in the cards somewhere. Okay, so next up I picked up the audiobook for God of Neverland, which is book 1 in the Defenders of Lore, and this is by Gamma Ray Martinez, and it was read by Simon Vance, and it's kind of like historical fantasy YA, I think. So Peter Pan has gone missing, and Michael, the youngest of the Darling children, is all grown up and tasked to go find him. Threats and danger impede the rescue. So it's kind of like not a retelling of Peter Pan, but like a follow-on. And unfortunately this one kind of fell flat for me. I gave it a 2.5 stars. I think this is probably my first Peter Pan not retelling, reimagining, that sort of thing, and it's not put me off trying more in the future, but it has left a lot to be desired, I would say. I thought it'd be cool to read from the perspective of characters that we were really familiar with but older, but in execution it didn't work because it read like a YA but with adult characters, and it wasn't quite a blend that made sense or worked for me, and I feel like if you was to be a young adult reading that, you might have quite a disconnect. And I mean, myself, as I'm not much of a young adult anymore, I'm just an adult, but I had that disconnect as well, I did enjoy the journey to find Peter, but I don't feel like I was ever truly captivated captivated throughout this story, and I don't really have much desire to pick up the sequel, unfortunately. It was an okay read, don't get me wrong, but nothing really pulled me fully into the world to be like, oh my god, I want the next book immediately, you know. Just interjecting here to add those extra books that I finished at the end of February. So we have one that was on my book tour for Hear Our Voices, and that was My Dear Henry, a Jekyll and Hyde remix. I've got a full review, or I've got a mini review rather, over on my Instagram, which is at HardcoreCupcakeHailstorm, and I've got a full review in Goodreads and Storygraph, which is always linked in the description. So I'll just kind of give you a more brief kind of synopsis of this and my overall rating. But we have a black queer retelling of Jekyll and Hyde set in Victorian London 1885, and this is part of the Classics Remixed series. So yeah, this is part of the Hear Our Voices book tour. I ended up giving this one a 3.5 stars, and that is my review. If you'd like to support my book tour stop, it's posted by the time this goes up over on Instagram. Then I have a NetGalley arc. This one is called Arca by Van Jensen, and it's about Earth dying and the rich are escaping. To keep the power at the top, the rich have made a spaceship of their own designs, and of course it keeps everybody in line until it doesn't. So I ended up giving this one a 1 out of 5 stars, unfortunately. It sort of reminded me of Snowpiercer in 1984, and I really loved the climax of the story, but I just didn't enjoy the rest of it and the way it kind of evolved. I feel like Pandora would have been a much better name for our main character because of the way she was unearthing secrets and like opening things she shouldn't have opened, but with hope at the end as the outcome. This was hard to read as like stylistically, I guess you could say. This particular arc, the panels on the top and the bottom were like cut off. It was really weird. I thought I'd like zoomed in by mistake, but no, it's just they'd cut it out. So I mean, most of the story I was guessing what people were saying and trying to make sense of it from the rest of the context. But yeah, for the end of February I read another Hear Our Voices book tour book, and this is Hungry Ghost. My review for this one is coming out in April, I believe, but I'm talking mainly about my favourite quotes, so I will go ahead and give you my thoughts here. So this is by Victoria Ying, and we're following Valerie, who has grown up with disordered eating, and how she has to navigate grief on top of that and seek help for these feelings and these things that are happening. So this was super eye-opening. It was a graphic novel, by the way. It was hard to read about Val and her mum's toxic relationship, particularly concerning food. You know, as you're reading it, you see that the mother doesn't really realise how much damage she's installing on her child, and how unhealthy she's sort of planting this unhealthy seed for her to fear food. It's really sad to see, and I find it doesn't really have much of a moral, like a character growth with the mother. But I mean, not everybody does grow, you know, in a way. But it was interesting to see how Val reacted to that and still wanted to better herself and her body. The art was beautiful, and I really loved the soft pink and blue tones of the illustrations. It wasn't distracting from quite a powerful story. So this one I gave a 3.5 out of 5. So let's get back to the rest of the video. Okay everybody, that is it for February's wrap up. Let me know what you got to read during that month, what your favourite book was, maybe what your least favourite book was, and what you'd recommend. If there's anything that you really felt pulled by, I would love to know. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, and I shall catch you in another video soon. Bye!